You see this road I'm standing on? That one right there? Looks pretty ordinary if not for the castle in the background, right? Well, looks can be deceiving. Where you see me at is in Windsor Park at the Long Walk and has a fascinating story and history. What is the Long Walk? Well, it's a famous tree-lined avenue in Windsor Great Park, stretching about 2.5 miles from Windsor Castle to the Copper House statue of King George III. It's a park, refuge for animals such as deer, and it's also the last great trip previous monarchs who have been buried at St. George's and Windsor Castle will complete. This last occurred in September 2022 after the state burial of Elizabeth II, with thousands of mourners lining the route to pay their respects. The coffin was taken from a hearse at the entrance of the grounds, then proceeded up the Long Walk, through the Cambridge Gate, to the Castle Quadrangle, and finally to St. George's Chapel for the committal service. The Long Walk was also part of the procession for her father, George VI, grandfather, George V, and great-grandfather, Edward VII, in 1952, 1936, and 1910, respectively. This tree-lined 2.64-mile avenue known as the Long Walk was originally a path from Windsor Castle to Snow Hill. The high ground is said to have been the location where King Henry VIII waited to hear the news that his second wife, Anne Boleyn, had been executed. Following the Restoration in 1660, Charles II had double rows of elm trees planted along the entire length of the path. The king was inspired to develop Windsor Castle and the surrounding parkland after he lived at the Palace of Versailles during his exile from Britain when it was under the control of Oliver Cromwell as the Commonwealth of England. The creation of the Long Walk was one of his first improvement plans. On the 12th of May of 1680, a royal warrant declared the commencement of the Long Walk, with the commission of the acquisition of land appointed on the 27th of July. Subsequent years were then devoted to reobtaining the land that would mark the Long Walk's route. In total, almost 28 acres of land were acquired, split amongst 25 separate holdings, with the largest at nearly 3 acres. Once planted, the Long Walk consisted of a double avenue of elm trees, supported with oak stakes, totaling at 1,652 trees, spaced about 27 feet apart. The width of the avenue was 150 feet between the inner rows and 210 feet between the outer rows. The Long Walk Avenue was completed by the time that King Charles II passed away in 1685. In 1710, the construction of a gravel pathway commenced down the center of the avenue. Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, who had a very sad life, enjoyed traveling around her parks in her carriages, and so the prospect of being able to travel between Windsor Castle and the Great Park in comfort, rather than simply horseback through the grass, was largely appealing. She needed some comfort after losing 17 children, one of whom is actually buried in the Windsor grounds. The previously mentioned Copper Horse is a statue of King George III atop Snow Hill. The cast statue, which was erected in 1831, is at the south end of the Long Walk, about 2.65 miles away from the King George IV Gateway at Windsor Castle. By 1859, the avenue's plantings were starting to show signs of deterioration, and the Duke of Bedford, Mr. Ralph Sneed, the Honorable Charles Gore, and Mr. John Clutton submitted plans to Prince Albert, the Prince Consort of Queen Victoria, for approval to future-proof the Long Walk. Oak was to become a substitute for elm between the double gates and Snow Hill, and fresh elm trees were to replace the existing elms between Windsor Castle and the double gates. In the 1920s, Dutch elm disease, caused by fungus, arrived in the UK, killing approximately 10 to 40% of the elm trees. In 1944, the last of the elm trees had to be felled due to old age or the Dutch elm disease, and there was a subsequent major replanting. Initially, the plan was to plant alternate London plane and horse chestnut trees, with the idea that retaining whichever species thrived best. However, both species grew successfully, and so in 1979, the trees were thinned selectively for the healthiest specimens. So there we are. This strip of land has been around for over 345 years and has seen many monarchs. Charles II, James II and VII, William III and Mary II, Anne, George I, II, III, IV, William IV, Queen Victoria, Edward VII, George V, Edward VIII, George VI, Elizabeth II, and now Charles III. All these monarchs have enjoyed this park, and how cool is it that I'm able to stand on it? How cool is it that this little paved road has been the final procession for 4 monarchs and possibly could be used for another later on in the future?